It's a Les Paul day. It's another friendly Norlin era example from the mid-70s, and this is a Les Paul custom. What makes a Les Paul a custom? Depends on the era. If it's 1954, it's custom because it's black, and it probably has a staple P90 in the neck pickup position. If it's 1957, however, it's black, but it might have 3 PAF humbucking pickups. In 1962, it's probably white, and it looks exactly like an SG. In 1972, it may have a cherry sunburst and 2 pickups, and it goes on and on. The consistent features that they do share throughout all those eras would be the split parallelogram headstock inlay, which is something they borrowed from some of their 1940s upper-end models. The headstock will be bound, and also, well, both headstock and the body will have this multi-line purfling scheme going on inside the binding. And then they'll have ebony fretboards as opposed to rosewood. So, mostly cosmetic features. Les Paul, the man himself, requested an upgraded signature model within a year of the original Les Paul guitar's release. The gold top, of course, was the standard issue. He wanted black because it's classy, for one thing, but I suspect it also made hiding his constant electronic experimentation a little bit easier. Les was not a woodworker. He would chop big ragged holes into his guitars with a dull chisel to fit, the various gizmos and pickup combinations he was working with. Matching gold top paint is tricky for the best of us. Everything sort of stands out like a sore thumb. But with black, you can, spray or even daub on some extra paint, and it kind of disappears visually if you're across the room. It's a little more forgiving. The Norlin era. Are they bad guitars? No, not necessarily. At least some of their features were aimed at correcting perceived problems in the original design, remember? They've got the volute on the back of the headstock. They've got a 3-piece laminated neck. Sometimes it was made of maple. In some cases, they also lowered the headstock angle so that it was less extreme. I say that every time, though, all of these things don't prevent headstock breaks. If you drop this guitar, the head is going to break. Even with this. It can't stop it. Sorry. You've got the so-called pancake body. 2 slabs of mahogany laminated on top of each other. Does that decrease the resonance? I don't know, maybe, if you're playing your Les Paul acoustically a lot. This is the era of the witch hat knobs, as opposed to the speed knobs. These things are definitely not speedy. This one is particularly stiff. The gold hardware on these is plated, of course. It does not take very long to wear through the plating. As soon as you look at it, it basically turns silver. Another thing many of these guitars share through the years are exceptionally low frets. In the 50s, they were known as the fretless wonder. They were still relatively narrow, but very low. And in the 70s here, they've gone to something akin to a jumbo fret wire in terms of width, but in height, around 27 thousandths, which, if you're really careful, you'll get one dressing out of. But it does not take long to wear them to the point where you end up making grooves in the fretboard. And a lot of people just find them uncomfortable to play because of the height. And this player, he really wants taller frets. So that's what he's going to get. Let's check the action. The player likes the setup. I will say, though, that when you change the frets on these and go to something that might be like 35 or 40% taller, it's going to feel like a different guitar. So these are quite low. That's just over 3/64ths on the bass side. And just over 3/64ths on the treble. Checking the neck relief, 8 or 9 thousandths, which is not bad. One area of inconsistency we see a lot during the Norlin years, and various other eras of Gibson's history, including the present, is the height of the bridge relative to the body. In this case, it's carrying the strings just a hair under 3/4 of an inch above the body. It'd be about 18 millimeters. Is that a bad thing? Maybe not. I mean, certain people suggest that that actually improves the sound of the guitar, having this jacked up really tall. Joe Walsh is one of those people, a famous Les Paul devotee. Of course, at some point you're going to run out of adjustment screw threads on these things. And this has a fairly low setup too, right? Like if you wanted to play this at a factory setup of 5/64ths, we might not be able to get that for you. The other thing is, if you're one of those people who like to deck the tailpiece or screw it in all the way so it's resting against the wood, that increases the break angle over the back of the saddles quite severely. And over time that can contribute to sinkage of the bridge. It'll take on a concavity, which can affect the height of the strings over the fretboard. But if you love Les Pauls, these are things you know and understand. The edges of the fretboard binding, in this case, are quite heavily rounded over from the factory, which can pose some issues. It makes it a little trickier when you're putting frets in. And here I'm just scoring along the edges of each fret prior to removal. You'll note that in keeping with Gibson tradition, these technically do have binding nibs, but the frets are so low and they're dressed down so much that they're basically not there. It's kind of like a perfunctory nod to the concept of the binding nib, but you know, no one cares if these go away. The customer says, no, get rid of them. And we're going to put the fret in such that it overlaps the end of the binding. We'll heat up the frets to make them come out a little easier. I like to start at the extreme end of the fret and try and get under it. Seems a little safer than starting in the middle, less likely to tear up wood. And you can see I'm pretty careful about this. I don't go yanking on them. Take my time. There. This is a pretty typical result. However, it's not uncommon for little flakes to get dislodged as they come up, especially right adjacent to the inlays here. And the grain is so short, there's very little support for it. So I'm going to try and get this back in before it gets lost. I'll position it, hold it in place with some tweezers, and get some thin super glue on it. This nut has been painted in place per Gibson's usual procedure. The lacquer extends over the sides, so I want to score that. I'm going to try and reuse the same nut if possible. I want to adjust the truss rod so the surface of the board will be good and straight. In any case, I want to make sure there's at least some tension on the nut before I go dressing the board. You can see here by the color of the pocket that this is one of the maple neck examples. It doesn't take much sanding, basically just cleaning up the area of the fret slots and also trying to extend the top surface over into that rolled portion of the fretboard to give the fret end something strong to key onto. I have to clean all the dust and gunk out of the fret slots, which is a little more difficult to do on a bound neck. These slots are just slightly shallow for the fret wire I'm going to be using, so I have to come back with my tiny little 0.6 millimeter end mill and establish the proper depth. I'll roll a radius into the wire. I've mentioned before that I do this in multiple passes, going a little bit at a time, because I've heard, and it seems to be the case, that you can actually work harden the wire into something more sturdy than as it comes from the factory. Make it a little more durable. And as always, have to use a little solvent to clean off the oily residue that comes from the manufacturing process. I mentioned this once before and it confused people, so I'll try again and be more clear. If you go to any luthier supply website and buy fret wire in 2-foot lengths, which is how it's normally sold, they will suggest that you need 3 lengths of wire to do a refret. But you can get away with 2 if you're conscious about how you cut it. So you take 2 lengths and alternate between them for each fret. So from the first wire you cut frets 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc. From the other piece of wire you cut 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. It works out nicely because the length of frets 12 to 22 is longer than frets 1 to 11, and you'll usually need more than 24 linear inches if you cut one and then the next, so you're into a third length of wire, but you won't be if you alternate. So it's a more efficient use of materials. If you're in the biz, it probably doesn't matter as much because you're buying in bulk, and you definitely should. If you're buying by the piece, you pay literally twice as much. 50 or 60 refrets a year adds up to at least a week's groceries. And the little packs of pre-cut fret wire, no way. Those are 3 times the cost. So first piece of wire, I'm cutting fret 1, fret 3. I'm giving myself about a 1/16 of an inch overage. Fret 5. By the time I get up to fret 21, there's just a little piece of waste. Same for that other piece of wire. That's all. Then I need to clip the ends so they'll fit over the binding with the fret nipper. That produces a reasonable cut. I don't want the tang to sit tight against the binding on both sides. There needs to be a little bit of play to take into account for seasonal movement. Sometimes if the board gets really dry, it'll crack through the binding at each fret end. The fret nipper always leaves a little bit of material on the underside of the cutout, which I have to get rid of with a file. If I don't, then it'll appear after the frets are dressed against the edge of the binding, and it looks a little funny. It's not as neat, so we get rid of that. I like to stagger the order of insertion for the frets, as this can equalize the lateral pressure the tangs are exerting out into the neck. If you start on one end and work towards the other, the compression can sort of multiply until you're putting a back bow into the neck. Staggering seems a bit more gentle, and it tends to stay straighter. That's a technique that's really important when you're dealing with guitars that don't have adjustable truss rods, but it's also applicable at other times too. If you got a nice straight neck, it's nice to keep it straight. It's important to make sure that each fret is fully seated before you move on to the next one, because occasionally, like we have here, you'll find a slot which is slightly too large for the fret tang in question. Have to pull it out again. And I'll use my fret tang expander. This is one I made myself. It's got a little point which fits into a narrow groove on the other side of the jaws, and that will make little bumps on the sides of the fret tang. And I can vary the pressure and change the amount of grip that the fret will have. StewMac makes a similar device. It's got more teeth on it. I like the single point contact because I can vary the amount of pressure it exerts. Maybe only half of the fret is loose, and I don't want to, put too much pressure on the other side, so I can vary it. I'll clip off the overhanging ends, holding my nippers so the jaws are vertical rather than horizontal. That limits the ability for them to pull the end of the fret up. Being extra sure to protect the finish over the body, I've got this old ratty card scraper that I can rest the nippers on. I'll dress a bevel into the ends of the frets using my file holder. Put a little marker on the top so I can see what I'm doing. This is a flat leveling beam that's got adhesive backed sandpaper on it. And I will dress those frets flat. Doesn't take very much. I'll do some recrowning, which is a step that Gibson really didn't do back in the day. They would grab some sandpaper and rub it over the top of the frets, just breaking the corners slightly, but they ended up oftentimes fairly flat in profile. At this stage, the ends of the frets are still quite square and very sharp if you rub your finger against them, so I'm going to break those corners off and, well, that's not the proper term. I'll produce a radius using a small safe edge file. This will be pleasant on the fingers for years to come. Whilst installing the frets, there was this one little area next to the inlay that popped off and flew away to who knows where, so I have to fill it. A generous scoop of ebony dust, followed by a tantalizing trickle of thin super glue. Upon curing, I'll scrape it level and then lightly sand. I'll apply a small amount of oil to the fretboard and then rub it in with tenderness and affection. As often happens to these old ABR bridges, the years have not been kind and it's taken on a sunken or concave appearance. So I'll use my press, designed for such occasions, and press it flat. We'll have a look-see inside the electronics compartment. And this all appears pretty standard, 1970s looking wiring. Dating these Les Pauls with their serial numbers can be a bit hit and miss. It's probably best to check out the pot codes if you can. This has got a lot of oxide on it. And in every instance, Gibson soldered over the date portion of the code, but here we can see that it is 1974. I'll give the pots a shot of electronics cleaner and then twirl the knobs back and forth furiously. The stiff shafts will get a shot of penetrating lubricant. Okay, Black Beauty, all set up and ready to go. Fret stressed out to about 44 thousandths tall, which is a significant change, and you can definitely feel the difference. Very nice guitar.